everyone. Welcome to today's event by air and by sea. We're talking about PRC coercion of Taiwan from the first Trump administration to the current one. I'm Michael Beckley. I'm the director of the Asia program here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and I'm delighted to be joined by Thomas Shattuck. Just before we get started, a quick housekeeping note. If you have questions during the event, then please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll work them into the conversation or leave some time at the end so that we can get to as many of them as possible. The man of the hour, though, is Thomas, and he's a fellow here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He's also the senior program manager at the University of Pennsylvania's Perry Worldhouse, and he has other affiliations with the Pacific Forum and West Point's Modern War Institute. And we'll focus today on a piece that just came out a few days ago by Thomas, which is called Searching for Taiwan's South China Sea Policy under Lai Ching-te. And we'll use that as a springboard to talk about Taiwan's broader security challenges. So, Thomas, I wonder if we could start by having you set the scene for us a bit. So, in your article, you highlight how Taiwan is often absent from discussions of the South China Sea, which is weird given that it borders it. And we tend to focus instead on China, of course, but usually the Philippines or maybe Vietnam. And so can you start by explaining why Taiwan matters in this space and what's at stake with places like the Pratas and Taiping Islands?
Yeah, I think the main point for why Taiwan matters in the South China Sea is Taiwan actually occupies the two largest islands or features in the South China Sea, as you said, Taiping Island and Dongsha Pratas Island. They're the largest natural structures in the entire South China Sea region. Taiwan has bases on both of those islands, and they've had them for a very long time. Uh, the reason that Taiwan doesn't seem to be a big player, I'd say, is twofold. One, Taiwan's international isolation is it does not have formal diplomatic relations with any of the countries that it is having a dispute with over the other features, islands, rocks, and the other things that we find in the South China Sea. And it isn't really as provocative as, say, the PRC is in trying to maintain its sovereignty or expand it. It's also not doing big energy exploration projects like we see with Vietnam or the Philippines, where that seems to be where a lot of tension occurs between either Vietnam, the Philippines, and Taiwan. So Taiwan seems to be like a steady presence, a calm presence, and in a news cycle where there's always things going on, if you're not making noise, you're not going to be a big party to this. And whenever there is these big conversations around a code of conduct, Taiwan pitches ideas, but it's never really a party to any sort of conversation. It's not an ASEAN on top of its lack of international space. So it really doesn't have a seat at the table. And as a result, when there are big newsy items like we've seen with the Philippines and China, um, people tend to forget that Taiwan is sort of a South China Sea country. It has a presence in the South China Sea formally. And the PRC's claims on the South China Sea are actually based off of the Taiwan or the Republic of China's claims. So the reason that we have this dispute is because of the lines drawn in the 1940s under the ROC regime.
Exactly. So it's based off of those maps, the nationalist maps, and it's interesting that Taiwan, as you say, seems to have a more passive position here, but it's not going to really have the luxury of staying out of these conflicts entirely. And you explained in your piece how Chinese oil platforms and rigs have been sitting inside Taiwan's exclusive economic zone near the Pratas for years. Those have been largely unchallenged until there was this recent report that brought them to light. And so I'm wondering, what do you make of this? Like, what does this say about Taipei's level of vigilance, and also about Beijing's tactics in relation to what they may come to expect from Taiwan going forward?
Yeah, I think that the main reason that Taiwan hasn't made a big deal about these oil rigs is because the South China Sea is just frankly not a priority for Taipei. They have bigger problems closer to home. Like these islands are not exactly easy to get to. It takes a while on an airplane or a boat to get to Pratas, even longer to get to Taiping. So why raise a stink when you already are getting challenged on Jinmen and Matsu with the Coast Guard going through your restricted waters or illegal fishing boats? around Jinmen Matsu, crossing the median line of the Taiwan Strait. So there are problems closer to home. And I think that that was the calculation, is why raise something that, all right, it's not really infringing per se on our sovereignty, because the PRC could argue, and I know there are people in Taiwan that argue after this report came out from Jamestown, is that the PRC in Taiwan never fully delineated their lines with the EEZs and restricted waters in the South China Sea, and that these are just in a gray zone. I don't necessarily buy that argument. Um, but it's also a little odd that it took 5 years for anyone to realize these things were there. Since May 2020, these oil rigs were within the EEZ of Pratas Island. However, you could argue, based on the 2016 arbitral award that the Philippines received against China, that Pratas does not get an EEZ because it's not technically an island, which the PRC and Taiwan both reject.
Hmm.
So at the end of the day, they're not going to make oil rigs a big issue when, at least on Pratas or in the Pratas area, illegal fishing is a much higher priority, whereas an oil rig is just kind of there taking the energy. And it doesn't seem like Taiwan is utilizing the South China Sea for the energy in the same way that the PRC or Vietnam is. So it wasn't a sticking point in an already tense relationship.
And do you think the fact that Taiwan has bigger things to deal with, the other offshore islands, as well as just the defense of Taiwan itself, you point out in your piece that President Lai has basically been entirely silent on the South China Sea, even in major speeches. And so, is this just a reflection of having so many things on the security plate at this point that they just have to pick and choose and prioritize? Or does that say anything else about Taiwan's long-term security strategy or really the viability of it?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of everything. Like, I think it's one, there are things closer to home, as I said, that um, defending Taiwan or the other outlying islands where there are civilian populations are much more important than two South China Sea islands that only have bases and no civilian populations. So you're not really protecting the people of Taiwan, you're just protecting the island and having that presence. But also, despite the news recently of the oil rigs and the occasional like illegal fishing boat, and like there's getting to be more of these things, which we'll talk about in a bit, that the PRC does not treat Taiwan the same way in the South China Sea as it does to the other disputant parties. The PRC is not ramming Taiwanese Coast Guard vessels. It's not water cannoning Taiwanese vessels. It's not shooting lasers or any of that. It's not trying to invade these islands. It's not planting flags. So when it comes to tensions and cross-strait issues, it's relatively calm. Like, sure, there are little piecemeal things here and there, but also let's be clear, President Lai was not the president in May 2020. It was someone else. And for 4 years, Tsai Ing-wen was president, and this also was not a big deal. So this is not unique to him. Um, the lack of any kind of policy or statement on the South China Sea is a bit more unique. But at the end of the day, like, there are much more tense areas and where the China Coast Guard is going head to head with Taiwan Coast Guard, or there's Navy or Air Force issues closer to Taiwan in the Taiwan Strait, southern Taiwan, and also to Taiwan's east. That if the PRC isn't making a huge deal about these two islands, because in a way, the PRC is getting its legitimacy from Taiwan's presence there through the Republic of China 9-line, 11-lines, that the PRC is going to let it sit, and maybe we'll start to see a slow incursion. But I think that also really depends on what's going on with the Philippines and Vietnam. That the PRC isn't going to raise any issues with Taiwan when it has higher priorities in either much more energy rich spaces or where the sovereignty is a little less clear.
Okay, so you mentioned that the oil rig comes to light when Tsai Ing-wen is the president. I've seen that the Ministry of the Interior has said that the South China Sea Islands belong to the Republic of China, and they've invoked Tsai Ing-wen's what they call the four principles and five actions. And so I'm wondering if you could help us understand what that is, but also how should we interpret that continuity? Does it suggest sort of a cautious holding pattern rather than some kind of new strategy under President Lai now?
Yeah, I would say, like, because it hasn't been a problem, whereas when Tsai Ing-wen was president, I think she was president for 2 or 3 months in 2016, and the arbitral ruling against China happened, and there's a lot of history there with Taiwan and not Taiwan not being a party to the ruling because its lack of membership in the UN, despite putting out position papers, and Taiwan believing that the arbitral ruling exceeded its boundaries by making the islands that Taiwan occupies technically not islands, so they rejected it outright. So Tsai Ing-wen was kind of forced into making some sort of statement on the South China Sea because it was a huge issue immediately. Now it's been almost 10 years. The arbitral ruling, really, no one has enforced it. Not much has gone on. It's there, and it's a good moral victory that the Philippines achieved, and they utilize that internet piece of international law to push back. But it's not Taiwan's problem when it comes to the Philippines issue. So Tsai Ing-wen, when she was president, put out a statement or a policy that the South China Sea Islands are part of the Republic of China territory, and that when I reached out to the Ministry of Interior trying to look at what is going on with Taiwan and the South China Sea, that they referred me to this policy that's almost 10 years old. Um, and the Coast Guard is supposed to be the one that administers these islands. That's why it's the Ministry of Interior and not National Defense, because in Taiwan, the Coast Guard is an Interior Ministry issue. But it's not really clear what do you mean the South China Sea islands are a part of ROC territory? Do you mean the two? Because there are technically only two islands in the South China Sea when you go by the definition of the word island. Or do you mean everything? Like, are you taking the expansionist approach that the PRC is taking, and it's just you are not taking the approach of pushing the boundaries of your sovereignty in the same way? So there's still a lot that's not clear. Other parts of the four principles and five actions are about how Taiwan supports freedom of navigation, the right to overflight, and the South China Sea should be a place where Taiwan can help with collaboration in science and marine science and biodiversity. It says a few things, but it doesn't really say like what specifically is our position, what are we going to enforce, what are we willing to do to enforce our position, and what does ROC sovereignty mean in the South China Sea under a Democratic Progressive Party president that seeks to amplify the Taiwanness of the country and kind of delimit and de-emphasize the ROC-ness of Taiwan.
Do you think Taiwan will be pushed into clarifying or updating its position, given that the Philippines has seemingly been much more assertive over its claims with the relatively new administration, as well as tightening its defense relationship and opening up new military bases for the United States, and then China reacting in part by really stepping up the coercion of Filipino vessels, blasting them with those water cannons, the lasers, even sometimes trying to board them with knives drawn. In other words, do other claimants around the South China Sea, can they draw Taiwan in, or do you see anything coming down the line that would force Taiwan to modify or change its position?
I honestly think we're at an inflection point, and Taiwan's response will be determined by the amount of action, coercion, aggression, whatever we want to call it, on the part of the PRC. Um, from the PRC perspective, it was the Philippines that started to be more aggressive by trying to reinforce the Sierra Madre, and that required a response because it was on PRC territory. And that is why the PRC claims that they're doing what they're doing, is that they had to do it. The Philippines said, this is our sovereign space. We won in 2016. You're now pushing us out of where is rightfully ours. If the PRC starts to do that to Taiwan, like if the oil rigs get multiply and there's more and more closer and closer, if we see more illegal fishing boats closer to Pratas Island or Taiping, especially Pratas, because Taiwan has made that like a marine reserve to try to protect the space, and that is connected kind of back to some of these other issues. That if they're illegally fishing and then Taiwan has to expel them, which is happening. This year alone, there's been over 100 incidents where the Coast Guard has had to push out illegal fishing boats around Pratas alone. And if that tension increases, then the China Coast Guard is going to have to come in to protect its citizens, similar to what happened with the Philippines in the South China Sea, where fishing boats go into us like a fishing area or an atoll or a reef, they swarm it so that way Filipino fishermen or Filipino Coast Guard is not able to get through because there's just hundreds of boats around. If that happens, then whoever is on Taiping or Pratas is going to essentially be stuck if you have to get there by air. So if there is greater tension on Taiwan Coast Guard against Chinese citizens, then China Coast Guard comes in. Then that's where the head-to-head could happen with the two Coast Guards. We've avoided that generally speaking. There have been Last year, there were 3 patrols around protests by the China Coast Guard. This year, there's been at least 12. So we're seeing the numbers go up. And that is what worries me, is that these numbers went from very little to nothing less than 5 years ago to now we're in double digits. And we saw that 5 years ago, almost to the day, in the airspace around Taiwan with the Air Defense Identification Zone military incursions that started around Pratas Island. And now, 5 years later, aircraft around China or Chinese and military aircraft are going across the median line of the Taiwan Strait every single day. This year alone, there have been 1,169 PRC aircraft and military aircraft across the median line of the Taiwan Strait. In 2020, it was 22. So we're seeing how something that could be so small, like, why are you talking about 12 Coast Guard incursions? Well, 5 years from now, that number could be gargantuan.
Is that what you see coming down the pipe? I mean, can you give us a sense of how you view China's policy here and what they may be likely to do in the coming years? I mean, I read your piece and grew extremely alarmed, basically for the exact reason you just sketched out. I mean, we saw the incursions across the median line and basically practicing a full-scale blockade of Taiwan and just the general military presence increasing dramatically over the last few years. And when I'm looking at these numbers with regard to China's Coast Guard showing up more often in this area, yes, it's still at 12, but that's an exponential increase. And the fact that, as you know, they were doing it sometimes with their trackers turned off, and so it's creating this much more coercive presence. Do you see that progressing in the same way because it's being driven by similar structural strategic forces? And if so, how sustainable is Taiwan's current enforcement approach? I mean, you detail how the Taiwanese Coast Guard has stepped up enforcement by boarding some of the Chinese fishing vessels, occasionally even using water cannons of their own. But I'm wondering if the trends continue as you've sketched out, how sustainable is Taiwan's Coast Guard presence and its strategy? And do you, in fact, predict that basically coming from Beijing, given everything else you know about Chinese foreign policy?
Yeah, I think there are probably 3 paths this could take. The one is the current path we're on, which is we'll see um, a little bit more action with the China Coast Guard around it just to protect its own civilian fishing vessels or because the oil rigs are there. Or sometimes it could just be they're going east to southern Taiwan or they're going south to somewhere else in the South China Sea. And the PRC doesn't make a big deal about it because Taiwan having those 2 islands is better than Vietnam or the Philippines or some other country that's not Taiwan. That's essentially where we are. The other path is what I sketched out, which is this is AGES 2.0, where there's a calculation that is made in Beijing that this is an area where we could squeeze Taiwan and really the MN or break the Ministry of Interior, not the MND's budget, on responding to illegal fishing boats, the maritime militia, or Coast Guard incursions, and make it untenable to constantly go out and chase them, so that eventually they don't have the gas and they can't actually chase us out, and then it becomes de facto ours, except for the fact that they're on this island. They don't have the ability to fish or anything and protect any civilians that are there, which are very low. The other path is, and it's starting to take a little bit of a hold, is there's growing doubts that the year 2027, which is the year that under the Biden administration was the conclusion, the PRC or the PLA would have the capability or ability to launch an invasion of Taiwan. Doesn't necessarily mean they would, but that's when they could have the ability to have a shot at doing it. That number has been pushed back, depending on who you talk to some point in the early 2030s. And if you've set a deadline of 2027 and people in China, like nationalists, are really ginning up, we have to do something, the South China Sea is probably the easiest place to do that. There are no Taiwanese civilians. It's just a small outpost for the Coast Guard. You could probably get it without firing a shot, just by preventing them from getting any resources in. You could starve them out. You could prevent them from getting gas. They wouldn't have power, even water. Those are the sorts of things that you could do to just push them out relatively peacefully. You could even claim that they need to be safely escorted away because the situation there is a humanitarian disaster. Um, that's another path. I'm probably somewhere in between all three. I think it's going to get worse, but the PRC is going to continue to focus on the Philippines until, say, Sara Duterte becomes president in Manila, or another more pro-China candidate, if it's not Duterte, becomes president, and then they don't have the tensions with the Philippines. As long as Marcos or another, let's call them a pro-Philippine sovereignty president, is in the Philippines, China is going to focus more on that issue in the South China Sea. And that frees up the resources for Taiwan to be the focus up north. Um,
Okay. Well, I want to have you sketch out some of these scenarios a bit more so that we understand the implications really for the broader regional security. So let's say we do see essentially a repeat of that air defense identification zone situation where what starts out as occasional intrusions around Pratas or Taiping becomes normalized and Taiwan's presence starts to erode in practice. Then what are sort of the knock-on effects of that? Is it just, ensconcing Chinese, paramilitary hardware in ever greater areas? I assume there are further implications of that that could really jeopardize Taiwan security as well as regional security and just international law effectively in the South China Sea.
yeah, if it goes the way of the ages, like the key difference is in September 2020, it started off with just aircraft flying and then going back. They were kind of between Pratas, which is southwest to Taiwan, if you can picture a map of the South China Sea and the Philippines and Taiwan. And then they would go back to China. It would take minutes, an hour, however long it took for the aircraft, depending on their route. The South China Sea issue is different because it would be primarily based at sea, and it takes a lot longer for a vessel to do whatever it wants to do to coerce or make its presence known. It's not going to be minutes, it's going to be hours. And depending on how well resourced or how big the vessel is, because China's Coast Guard has very substantially sized vessels, they could just hang out for a while. And the more that the PRC is able to just be within the EEZ or even closer to the restricted waters or within the 12 nautical mile area, then that becomes less Taiwan and it's more China. Um, and you could prevent reinforcements coming in or just the regular turnover. As I said earlier, like there are ways you could just prevent anyone from coming in, and you can only go out. And if, say, President Lai decides that this is not a good use of Taiwan's resources and they leave, you're essentially handing China over a fully outfitted military base that is a natural island. You don't need to sand dredge, you don't need to break down the coral, you don't need to build out anything because everything's there. And it would make it very easy and quick for China to put missiles, to build out the dock, put a marine contingent there. It would be safer for the fishermen coming from China to actually fish there without fear of Taiwan pushing them out. So, depending on what calculations are made in Taipei, this could turn very badly for the other claimants. Taiwan could end its dispute in the South China Sea per se very peacefully, but then you lose the ability to track any movements coming from the south towards the north to Taiwan. You don't have your radar. You don't. You could, if you want to put missiles on the islands, if you're Taiwan, you don't have that ability to have another flank in the event of a worst case scenario for Taiwan. You lose all of that. You lose visibility of an entire theater of conflict in the event that an invasion were to occur.
Do you see Taiwan maybe in back channels getting together with, say, the Philippines or other countries around the South China Sea? Because I assume they've gamed this out themselves, and so it certainly highlights the idea of a truly regional security architecture being optimal, so that they can band together and collectively bargain essentially with Beijing. Do you see any of that going on, or that there's a possibility of that going on, especially if China continues to increase its presence and grow more aggressive?
So Taiwan, as I mentioned earlier, like if it's going to be a multilateral dispute kind of negotiation, if you bring in more than just the Philippines, if you bring in Vietnam or the other parties, it's going to fall apart once Taiwan's brought up. So if Taiwan were to try to approach the Philippines or Vietnam on a deal, that is much more likely at a bilateral level, because if you're seeing the same type of coercion as China, like why would I exclude this country that has great experience combating different levels of coercion? When it comes to the Philippines, that's the most likely candidate to make some sort of I don't think a deal is the right word, maybe an MOU. I know Taiwan has had progress and even made an MOU with the Philippines on fishing issues during the Ma administration. They did one with Japan. Um, but it's a long, hard road when it comes to something like the South China Sea for the Philippines, because the Philippines' number one external foreign policy priority is the South China Sea. And Taiwan and how it treated the 2016 ruling, is there's still a little bit of bitterness in Manila on how it kind of just like kicked the can or flipped the table and said, we're out. And the fact that Taiwan really ROC lines are what caused the entire issue with China. But we're seeing progress in the unofficial relationship. Taiwan's foreign minister actually a few weeks ago went to Manila with a business delegation. The only reason that he was able to do that is because earlier this year, the executive office of the president in Manila released a memo that made it easier for different people in Manila and Taipei going back and forth. It was a similar version to what happened during the first Trump administration with the Taiwan Travel Act, which reduced the restrictions on the ability for American officials of a certain stature to go to Taiwan and vice versa. This was the same thing, but a memo, and it prevented essentially everyone but the president and vice president from going to each country. So within less than a year, the foreign minister is now in Manila, having meetings, but it is a business delegation. He said statements in support of the Philippines around the Scarborough Shoal. So Taiwan's sending the right messages, but to come to some sort of agreement, to band together to push them out, it's possible because it would be a Coast Guard agreement. It would not be a military agreement. And that is key when it comes to Taiwan, is they have a lot of Coast Guard cooperation with the United States. But when it comes to Navy, then that really complicates issues.
Okay, well, I'm wondering if you can elaborate on some of the implications as you see it for the United States and for regional policy. So it sounds like the parties on the ground, yeah, there's some minimal sort of business delegations going back and forth, and maybe that can expand to include Coast Guard. But it doesn't look like there's going to be some kind of security organization coming together to band together against China. But I'm wondering if you think the United States has any role to play here, either in trying to spur regional cooperation or doing bilateral cooperation with some of these actors to try to restore some semblance of deterrence over the situation, so that those numbers don't continue to go up and China doesn't continue to ensconce itself in the area. So from your perspective, you know, what really should Washington be doing to integrate Taiwan more cleanly into this picture? I know from a U.S. perspective, usually the South China Sea tensions are much more about the Philippines.
Yeah.
But what, if anything, should the United States be doing here?
So I think the US obviously has a key role because it seems like all of these different countries in the South China Sea and even as far north as Japan are all doing things independently or in coordination with the US to push back against PRC coercion. Like the US does regular patrols and freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea to combat the PRC rules, that they've established there. The US Philippine relationship is really going into hyper overdrive as a result of the tensions, and the Philippines is trying to modernize its military and coast guard to be able to push back. We're seeing new missiles and tracking systems that the Philippines is getting. We're seeing new air bases through the EDCA agreement. We're seeing new naval bases with better docks. Like the U.S. is helping the Philippines help itself. When it comes to Taiwan, um, during 2021, the Biden administration established a Coast Guard working group with Taiwan, and that was in response to a Coast Guard law that the PRC had established. Um, Not much publicly has gone on with that. We also know that under the Biden administration, there was a secret military or naval drill that the United States did with Taiwan, where it happened, and then a month later we found out about it, and it was, I forget the exact term, but it was like, oh, we just both happened to be in the same spot, and we kind of sailed by each other, but it was coordinated. Um, One space that Taiwan has really failed to get integrated to, which is really important and has congressional support, is in RIMPAC. Every other year, we have the Rim of the Pacific exercise, and every year Congress calls, or it is the sense of Congress that the United States should invite Taiwan. It does not mandate an invite to Taiwan to participate in RIMPAC. And if RIMPAC is a Pacific exercise with the major navies of the world, not even just Pacific navies, but European navies that have a presence in Asia, And the thing we're all thinking about and planning for and making strategies about is a Taiwan conflict or deterring one. Why are we not including Taiwan? Obviously, the answer to that is the fear of other countries not wanting to participate. Well, then you have an answer right there. If you are a country that is not willing to participate because Taiwan is there, the United States probably can't count on you now to come to the help of Taiwan or the United States if a Taiwan conflict were to blow up out of proportion. Um, so the US could be that catalyst that could bring these two coast guards together. And there is an MOU, I will say, between the Philippines and Taiwan's Coast Guard. And Taiwan's Coast Guard has been in the Philippines for trainings, conversations, and things. But again, a lot of things that are Taiwan related, we either don't know they happen or we know they happen months later. They're not big and showy, and that is also part of Taiwan's strategy because of lessons from Nancy Pelosi's visit in 2022.
Mm. Is that sense of restraint or even fear? Do you see that continuing in the Philippines? Because on the one hand, as you mentioned, the Philippines is bolstering its own military capabilities, getting missiles that could potentially sink Chinese ships, and then obviously opening up military installations for the United States. Obviously, the Americans would want to be able to use Filipino territory in some kind of Taiwan contingency, but I assume the Philippines would very much like to stay out of a potential conflict over Taiwan, and yet you have the fact that the South China Sea and they face the common adversary there. Theoretically, should at least create some kind of common ground, and some of these backdoor channels, MOUs, et cetera, suggest that there's at least that kind of thinking going on. Do you see the debates around the Philippine security changing in ways that start to think bigger picture about potential Taiwan contingencies, or do you see very much a desire to avoid becoming entrapped and entangled into potential Taiwan scenarios? And so, while the Americans may be very excited about the expanding defense relationship with the Philippines, that's not something the Americans may be able to count on if there's some kind of major conflict over Taiwan.
Yeah, obviously the Philippines wants to stay out of any of it, but since Marcos has took office, he himself has made a lot of comments that have gotten him into trouble with China about how if there were a conflict, oh yeah, we would be involved. He says that a lot. We'll be involved somehow. But what does that mean? He does not elaborate. Members of the Coast Guard in the Philippines and members of the armed forces of the Philippines have also all started making statements. There's been a reorganization of the Philippine military to make it easier for the northern Luzon area to have command. A new Coast Guard monitoring station was made or was built out on one of the tiny islands in the northern Philippines. It's actually closer to Taiwan than it is to what we would consider the Philippines proper. So planning and statements are happening. How do those translate into direct conversations with counterparts in Taiwan? I don't know. I do know that at the Coast Guard level, like members of like a high level member of the Philippines Coast Guard was in Taiwan for like a panel event of some kind. And then that creates an opportunity to have those types of meetings. So there's the track 2 dialogues or track 1.5 dialogues provide those opportunities. But at the end of the day, like there are a lot of considerations that the Philippines needs to take into account, which one of them is there is over 100,000 Filipinos living in Taiwan. The Philippines is in the south, the closest country to Taiwan. To the north, it's Japan. If there is an evacuation and there is a refugee crisis in Taiwan, anyone in southern Taiwan is going to try to get to the Philippines however they can. If the United States gets involved in a Taiwan conflict, what is going to happen to the waterways that are between southern Taiwan and northern Philippines? What's going to happen to any US military presence in the Philippines? Does that become a target? Are they going to get hit? What happens to Philippine airspace if missiles are going over to hit naval assets in the Western Pacific? There are a lot of issues that the Philippines needs to game out and needs to consider because there's one thing about getting your people out of Taiwan, but there's another entirely different issue that you actually become a full-blown combatant with your treaty ally against China.
Mm. Well, I know the Japanese have expressed similar reservations and have been thinking about similar questions. And I'm wondering if you could bring Japan into this conversation. I know it's not the focus of of your paper. But is Japan just much more focused on either a potential Taiwan contingency or things going on in the East China Sea, or do you see, there's this sort of general trend of some people think Japan is becoming much more of a lead security actor in the Asia Pacific. Part of it may have to do with concerns about reliability of the United States and the U.S. Japan alliance, but also just a big reaction to China's own aggressiveness, and so taking security much more seriously, increasing the defense budget, et cetera. So do you see Japan playing any type of role in these developing disputes in the South China Sea, especially those vis-a-vis Taiwan, or is this really segmented between the East China Sea and the South China Sea?
I think Japan is a key player, regardless of the issue with American reliability. When Biden was president, Japan really took a renewed interest in the Philippines. They now have a reciprocal access agreement that they did not have 5 years ago. So Filipino and Japanese troops can go back and forth for training purposes. That didn't exist. And I credit that largely to PRC coercion of both countries. Japan is now floating this concept called the One Theater concept, which seeks to link the Korean Peninsula, East China Sea to the South China Sea. They don't mention the Taiwan Strait, but how do you get from the East China Sea to the South China Sea? You go through Taiwan. It's about linking up three, what now is separate theaters of war into one larger concept. Korea hates that concept. The Philippines actually likes that. The Trump administration is, I think, right now thinking about it. I know when Secretary Hegseth was there earlier this year, he had conversations with the minister in Japan, on Minister of Defense of Japan, and he brought up that concept. So it is a realistic concept, regardless of whether you agree with it or not, that if there's war in Taiwan or East China Sea or South China Sea, America's assets all around, and they're not just going to stay there. Whether they just do something else as a distraction to pull other resources to other parts of Asia, that is still a role. The issue with Japan in particular is its peace constitution. It can only get involved in the Taiwan conflict under certain situations. Like there's obviously the U.S. security treaty that if it gets invoked, they would have to help. If China were to strike US bases in Japan, particularly Okinawa, that creates a certain threshold. If China decides that we need to take Japan out early in an early stage part of an invasion of Taiwan, that is a higher level issue of a response. So it really depends on how the PRC handles Japan and its security situation within a Taiwan, worst case scenario. And that response will determine the level legally of what Japan is able to do.
And in addition to Japan, I want to have one more question about an outside actor before we bring this back to Taiwan. But with the United States, I mean, there's been some fretting within the Beltway that U.S. policy is basically shifting towards an emphasis on essentially money and homeland defense, and that even the original priority of shifting to the Indo-Pacific or whatever they're going to call it now is just no longer in the cards. And so you have a United States that's not going to be as heavily involved either over a situation with Taiwan or these broader conflicts in the South China Sea. Do you see that happening? You just mentioned that Hegseth was actually promoting this region-wide security concept, but do you think that the United States will actually have the big stick in theater in order to try to promote that and to really lead the charge here? Or do you see the United States kind of taking a much more offshore position in the long run, just given current political trends?
I think it really depends on how the Trump administration perceives how each country is handling its own defense. So we see the Philippines asking for help, but also trying to help itself. And it's also, frankly, the only country in the region that's regularly head to head, almost sometimes ship to ship, confronting China. So they can make the argument, regardless of whatever whatever percentage of GDP they want to or are spending on defense, they can say, look, like we're getting our sailors are getting injured. We're on the front lines. We're doing the things that you are criticizing other countries. Even you could go as far as NATO, and we're putting our sailors, our troops, where our mouth is. We need help, and we need more. When it comes to Japan, like with the new national defense and security strategy there, they're developing counterstrike capabilities to strike deeper into an enemy territory, which means China. With Taiwan, I know there's the huge debate on how much money should Taiwan spend on its defense. Is it 10%? Is it 3? Is it 5? They're increasing or trying to increase their defense spending, which sends the signal. But Taiwan's issue has always been spending the money on the right stuff. And I can see excuse me, a key point of tension is when Taiwan makes its big arms sale ask, which has been expected now since Trump took office, is the US trying to dictate the things that Taiwan is requesting to buy from us. Biden actually rejected a couple of things. I could see the Trump administration doing that. And if we see a continued pattern of asking for like tanks or things that the Department of Defense does not believe would be relevant in a cross-strait conflict, there's going to be tension there. When it
Mm,
comes to the defense of the homeland issue, I think that that's a bit too far out, and that far out, like it requires money to build the Golden Dome. Where's that money coming from? And if Golden Dome is developed, like how quickly is that? Is that in a year? Is that 10 years? So what is the timeline of that? And what resources are going to be diverted to help develop that technology? Because if the Trump administration can do it before Trump's second term ends, sure, I can see a situation where defense of the homeland is key. We have that. Why are we now having troops abroad? Like that is the one side of the argument. On the other side, there are people in the Trump administration who are staunch supporters of Taiwan. Marco Rubio, when he was in the Senate, met with Tsai Ing-wen when she was president. When he was in the Senate, he pushed a lot of laws. Some of them became law, some of them didn't. But he is one of Taiwan's number one supporters in the Senate. And you can see how quickly someone changes when they become Secretary of State. There's all of a sudden the burden of the one China policy that goes on to a Secretary of State that does not exist when you're in the House or the Senate. Hegseth has made comments. Elbridge Colby has also, before went into government, has made a lot of comments on the defense of Taiwan and defense reform. So I don't think that we can expect a full-on abdication of any sort of defense of Taiwan, even though we are not required by treaty or law to defend Taiwan. And Trump has been much more vague than Biden. It really goes down to whatever the president of the United States wants to do at any given time, because the Taiwan Relations Act is not a treaty, and depending on how you read it, you could go either way.
okay. Well, let's bring this back to Taiwan before we close things out. We had one of the participants wanted to gain some clarification about the implications of China's incursions into Taiwan's EEZ and surrounding some of Taiwan's offshore islands here. You did a great job earlier explaining how if Taiwan were to basically get out of Taiping, for example, that basically China would inherit a ready-made base, which would be a great forward operating site to project more power into the South China Sea. What about for an actual assault on Taiwan itself? That's what this participant wants to know. So these islands, the space in the South China Sea, how would that function if there was some type of cataclysmic war over Taiwan? And maybe you can help us kind of scope this out a bit.
Yeah, so if the situation is as it is today and there is a conflict tomorrow, the the Taiwan Coast Guard that is there won't really play much of a factor. Their role would be having the PRC come in and trying to defend the island, which would divert some resources. But as long as Taiwan is there, then there are not Chinese missiles there that could hit US ships longer range, because Taiping Island in particular would increase the southern range that China would be able to have, and Protas would get a little further east than some of its other um, military bases there. But I don't think, as of today, the situation would be that significant for Taiwan to use those islands to defend itself. The issue is when Taiwan loses control, however that may be, of those islands, and if there is enough time for China to retrofit the turnkey military bases, that would have a much more negative impact on that future conflict. It would essentially cut the South China Sea off from the US Navy. The Philippines would be much more limited in what it could do to support the US because those islands are very close to the Philippines. Um, and the PRC would essentially end the debate on what the South China Sea is. It would be a truly China Sea. It would have full domination in the military space of that entire region, which would then make sure it does not have to divert any resources to defend that in a further north conflict in Taiwan.
And another viewer wants to know about whether we should be thinking about Mazu or Jinmen in this context. The viewer notes that there's been reports that Chinese fishing boats have been circling Mazu with all of these LED lights on those. Should these be interpreted as gray zone tactics that are part of a broader strategic picture here, or do you view these things as somewhat separate in terms of their implications for Taiwan?
They're related, but I would classify them a little different because the Jinmen and Matsu, given how close they are to China and their historic and deep roots to Fujian province, are almost viewed in the same way as the South China Sea, where what is the strategic value for China to attack one of those things like Jinmen or Matsu? Like the comparison is always made to Crimea, and I just don't see that happening. Like, why would you waste like the international condemnation that you would receive for doing that to one of those islands when that's not the prize? And the great roots that those people have with each other. Like I lived on Jinmen for a year. I've taken the ferry to Xiamen. Like I know how close these things are. But there are significant gray zone tactics going on. The reason the South China Sea artificial islands exist as they are is because of the sand dredging around Matsu. The beaches in Matsu 10 years ago don't exist anymore in the same way because the sand was taken and stolen from Chinese sand dredgers and used in the South China Sea. On Jinmen, we saw a few years ago, the Taiwan Coast Guard, sorry, tried to chase out an illegal fishing boat around Jinmen's restricted waters. In the pursuit, the boat capsized and two of the fishermen died. That caused a huge controversy in cross-strait relations. The PRC then rejected the concept that Jinmen has restricted waters because it's kind of in a bit of a cove or bay around the rest of, or surrounded by China. And now we see regular Coast Guard incursions just doing an ADIZ tactic. You just sail through like the corner of what we would consider Jinmen restricted waters. That happens every day. So there is this slow erosion of frontier, so to speak, Taiwan islands. Jinmen and Matsu are the two primary ones. That are you really going to send a Coast Guard vessel out to like after that little corner gets cut and the amount of resources spent for that? Um, Probably not. If they're really staying there, you're going to scare them off. But it's the same exact thing that I just talked about in the South China Sea. There's civilian fishing boats that incur on Jinmen, and then the Coast Guard goes out to chase them. There's a controversy. People died. It's one of the rare occurrences where people died in cross-strait relations in the very recent future, and the China Coast Guard, in as much as it could, really dropped the hammer.
Well, to close us out, I was wondering if you could explain a bit what you think the implications should be for Taiwan. I know we're generally not in the business of providing unsolicited advice for nations where we're not taxpayers, but you've done so much of this research. You have a granular understanding of the situation on the ground, and I at least detect some sort of concern or veiled criticism of existing Taiwanese policy here. And so, if you were to go into President Lai's office right now, what would be the bottom line that you would take away from this? What actions should Taiwan be taking, or is there something that they shouldn't be doing that they're currently doing? What's the bottom line takeaway for Taiwan?
The bottom line is they need to make a decision on what is the strategic value for Taiwan's defense with its islands in the South China Sea. Are they worth spilling blood over? Is this just a historic legacy that you are keeping because of domestic issues with what is the ROC versus Taiwan? And like as we talked about, like start pushing south with the Philippines on trying to get greater bilateral cooperation on these issues. Because if you start sharing information around PRC movements, doing lessons learned on tactics that have worked to stop or slow PRC coercion, you need to have done that yesterday. And the same with Japan. Like, what is stopping the first island chain from actually truly cooperating other than the fear of China doing something? China's doing something every day. So it may be now time for these three countries to start cooperating as much as they can and are legally allowed to. With US relations, it's time to make the ask for the arms sale. And it's also incumbent upon the Trump administration to utilize its legal authorities through foreign military financing and the presidential drawdown authority to start giving Taiwan or selling Taiwan things that it needs in to combat this gray zone stuff. Whether it's in the South China Sea, on Jinmen, Penghu, or anywhere around Taiwan, there's a lot of ability that Trump himself has that could increase Taiwan's ability to defend itself tomorrow.
Okay. Well, are there for our viewers that want to learn more about the situation, or they want to see maps where they can actually look at all of these islands, or trackers so they can see either PRC or Taiwanese or Filipino activity? Are there certain resources that you would recommend that folks check out? Obviously, besides your article searching for Taiwan's South China Sea policy.
Yeah, obviously, first, take a look at the article. I would say a great resource is Ray Powell and his project Sealight. He does regular tracking of PRC movements throughout the South China Sea. And like I understand the comment made there is some of these things are so tiny that like the words on Google Maps are bigger than the actual island or feature. So there are other resources. I'd put you in the direction of Project Sealight, where you can see on a daily basis what is happening in the South China Sea. Now, Ray primarily focuses on PRC Philippines issues, but when the PRC does things related to Taiwan, you'll really get to see how a lot of these things connect.
Okay, well, we're going to put this video up on YouTube so people that are interested can watch. There's so much here that you really brought out for us, Tom. So I really appreciate it. And then obviously, please check out Tom's article, Searching for Taiwan South China Sea Policy under Lai Ching-te. And with that, we'll let you go. Thanks so much, Thomas, for sharing your insights. This really highlights how the South China Sea, it's not just about Southeast Asia. We tend to segment the Taiwan issue and Southeast Asia and the South China Sea, but you show clearly the extreme amounts of overlap, both in security and sovereignty issues in the area. With that, we'll leave it there, and I look forward to seeing all of our members and participants in the next event. Thank you so much, Thomas Shattuck, for all your great research and for a wonderful event.
Yeah, thanks for having me.